What would be the worst set of circumstances that a person could be forced to suffer? Perhaps someone whose life is marred by constant pain and disease. Or maybe worse than this even would be the life of someone enslaved and abused who is subjected to all manner of undignified treatment. Now, nobody would choose to live either of these lives, but suppose we did find ourselves in such circumstances. Could we still live a good life? Or would the very possibility of living well have been precluded for us? These are the kinds of questions that motivate the work of Epictetus. Epictetus was a Greek philosopher born in the year 50 AD, and he is one of the primary proponents of the Stoic philosophy. Stoicism holds that living well requires focusing on what is within our power, controlling our emotions, and detaching ourselves from concern for external goods. And Epictetus himself had a unique perspective on these issues from spending the early portion of his life in slavery. Being born a slave, it could seem that Epictetus was a perfect example of someone destined to live poorly. A perfect example of how human flourishing just is not possible for everyone. Yet what we get from Epictetus' writings is an approach to life which makes human flourishing possible no matter our circumstances. No matter what disadvantages we are dealt or misfortunes we have to suffer, once we recognize what it truly means to live well, we will also realize that no external circumstance can hinder our flourishing. In this video, we will explore these ideas by looking at some passages from Epictetus' most well-known writing, the Enchiridion, which is also known as the Handbook of Epictetus. And in this work, Epictetus spells out the Stoic approach to living well, achieving freedom, and facing death. Epictetus begins the Enchiridion with a distinction that provides the foundation for his entire view of the good life. Epictetus tells us that there are things which are within our power, and there are things which are beyond our power. Some things we can control, and some things we cannot control. And Epictetus believes that the natural human tendency we have to focus on, worry about, or even obsess over things we cannot control is the main impediment we face to living a good life. As such, in order to live well, we must understand the difference between these two things. So what is within our power, and what is beyond our power? Let's begin by considering the latter. Epictetus tells us that body, property, reputation, and office are all not within our power. Here he has in mind things like health, strength, wealth, what people think about us, and any position of social, political, or institutional authority that we might happen to hold. Notice that all these things would fall under the category of external goods. And in Epictetus' view, it is not within our power to attain any of these things. It is not within our power to stave off illness, to become wealthy, garner the adulation and praise of other people, or secure desirable employment. All of this is beyond our power. Now, at first, this claim might seem too extreme. After all, aren't there concrete steps we can take to achieve these goals? Can't we eat healthy and exercise to maintain our health, put in long hours at work to become wealthy, cultivate a pleasing disposition that attracts other people to us, and achieve the educational requirements that our dream job demands? Aren't all of these things within our power? And doesn't this mean that these things are within our control to some extent? Epictetus would not deny that any of that is true. He is not arguing that we are completely helpless in the pursuit of our goals or that our choices make no difference. However, what Epictetus is searching for is a manner of living that guarantees us a life well lived. Specifically, a way that we can live well without needing to depend on luck or fortune. But luck and fortune always play some role in our ability to attain all of the previously mentioned external goods as well as any other external good. Severe illness or injury can afflict even those most attentive to their health. The best laid business plans can be undone by the capricious nature of financial markets. Our best efforts to be well liked might just be misunderstood by other people. And of course, we are never entirely in control of what others think about us in the first place. For that matter, neither can we control what job applicant will be selected. To some degree, whether large or small, chance always plays a role in these things. For that reason, despite there being steps we can take to make success more likely, succeeding in these areas is never completely within our power. Consequently, Epictetus tells us that none of these things are properly our own affairs. If external goods are outside of our control, then what can we control? What should we focus our attention on? Here Epictetus points us to various actions of the mind: opinion, aim, desire, and aversion. We control what we believe, what we strive for, what we would like to have, and what we would like to avoid. We may not control whether we are hired for our dream job, but we do control whether we believe that job is worth pursuing. We are in control of whether that job is something we find desirable, and of whether failure to attain that job is something that we desperately wish to or need to avoid. It makes sense why Epictetus would identify these mental acts of belief, will, desire, and aversion as what lies within our control. Many things can prevent us from achieving what we want in the world, but nothing can prevent us from thinking one way or another. Nothing that goes on outside of us can control our hopes, dreams, fears, and anxieties. Everything within the theater of our own mind seems to fall squarely within our control. However, I think it is also important to point out that there are some complications here that this simple characterization may gloss over. And I think we can see this most clearly by considering the nature of desire and aversion. Desire refers to that which we want, while aversion refers to that which we want to avoid. Now, to what extent are you in control of what you desire and what you don't want to happen to you? Perhaps you want to learn to play the piano, kick a 50-yard field goal, comprehend the entire works of Plato, become a parent, or simply binge watch Netflix. Suppose, however, that you became dissatisfied with any of these desires, or you came to believe that you should get rid of one or more of these things that you want. Perhaps you began to think that what you previously wanted was unrealistic, a waste of time, or just a mere distraction from something more important. How easily could you do that? Can we change our desires by simply snapping our fingers? In most cases, this would not seem possible. If it was something we really did want, then it would seem odd if we could effortlessly let it go. If that were possible, then how much did we really want it in the first place? The same could be said about our aversions. People are afraid of and anxious about many things, and this fear and anxiety can have a crippling effect on our lives. It is for this reason that someone might seek therapeutic help. But of course, if we could simply change our aversions on a whim, then that really wouldn't be necessary. So, Epictetus is not saying that our desires are within our immediate control. We cannot change our desires simply by wishing they were different. Rather, changing our desires and aversions requires focus, attention, and consistent training. Specifically, living a Stoic life requires training ourselves to desire only that which is within our power. The difference, however, between the Stoic effort we exert toward controlling our desires and the effort we might exert toward the attainment of external goods is that the success of the former is entirely within our power. When we work to discipline our desires, we may not be able to attain immediate success, but we can know that our ultimate success cannot be undermined by poor fortune or external circumstance. It is an endeavor in which our success or failure depends entirely upon our own actions and entirely upon our willingness to train ourselves. Now, there's much more to say about this topic than I can say here, but for further explanation of Epictetus' view about how we discipline our desires and aversions, see the supplemental lecture entitled Desire, Aversion, and Stoic Self-Control, which is linked in the description section below. But why is focusing on what is within our power the key to living well? In the second paragraph of the Enchiridion, Epictetus paints a picture of what life is like for those who focus on what is within their control, and also what life is like for those who strive after what is beyond their power. The person who seeks what is beyond their control struggles for what is weak, dependent, restricted, and alien. Because external goods are subject to chance and fortune, pursuing these things renders us dependent on external forces. We will feel weak and restricted when we are forced to reckon with our inability to attain what we want. And ultimately, Epictetus believes we will become alienated from what really matters for living well. By contrast, when we limit our pursuits to that which is within our control, we seek what is free, unrestricted, and unhindered. If we focus on what we can control, if we focus on controlling, restraining, and conditioning our desires, then we will gain a sense of empowerment and freedom. There is no external circumstance that can prevent us from disciplining our mind. There is nothing that can hinder us in this pursuit. There is nothing that can restrain us, and thus, there is nothing that can take away our freedom. In Epictetus' view, suffering is rooted in failing to recognize that pursuing external goods inevitably undermines our freedom and independence. He tells us, remember then that if you attribute freedom to things by nature dependent and take what belongs to others for your own, you will be hindered, you will lament, you will be disturbed, you will find fault both with gods and men. When we make some external good our goal, the inevitable consequence is psychological disturbance and negative emotions. We will lament our situation when something hinders us. We might say, why did this have to happen to me? Why aren't things going differently in my life? We will suffer by blaming ourselves for our own inadequacies, even though chance makes a guarantee of success impossible for everybody. We will think of ourselves as failures when we cannot achieve our desired end. And the blame may not end there. We may also be tempted to extend blame to gods and men. When things do not go our way, how tempting is it to blame someone else, whether deservedly or not? Or to think that the universe itself must be conspiring against us. This common response to personal disappointment, misfortune, and tragedy inevitably poisons our happiness. Instead of accepting our life circumstances for what they are, accepting that certain things are outside of our control, working to reconcile ourselves to our present situation, and to appreciate what is good in our lives, we become resentful, bitter, and disempowered. Fortunately, we can enjoy all the opposite benefits if we concern ourselves only with what is within our power. If we do this, then no one will ever compel you, no one will restrict you, you will find fault with no one, you will accuse no one, you will do nothing against your will. No one will hurt you, you will not have an enemy, nor will you suffer any harm. Epictetus identifies 3 distinct benefits of focusing on what is within our control. First, doing so prevents us from having to depend upon anything outside of ourselves. Consequently, there is nothing that can restrict, compel, or control us. This is the most complete form of freedom we can aspire to achieve. In these remarks, we can detect the influence of Epictetus' own experience of being a slave. Intuitively, it would seem that it would be impossible for him to attain freedom while being held in bondage. Yet Epictetus rejects this way of thinking about freedom. There is a kind of freedom that can be had under any circumstances, even those circumstances that seem most antithetical to living freely. There is a kind of freedom that is just as available to an emperor as it is to a slave. There is much more to say about this Stoic conception of freedom than I can cover in this video. For further discussion of this conception of freedom, I encourage you to watch the supplemental lecture video entitled Stoic Freedom and the Desire for External Goods, which can be found in the description section below. Secondly, this way of living affords a certain kind of protection. When our focus is properly restrained, there is nobody who can hurt us or harm us. This may seem like a strange claim. Even if I perfectly place my attention on just those mental acts that are within my control, can't others harm us in all sorts of ways? Can't another person injure me or steal from me, unjustly persecute me, banish me from society, or even kill me? Epictetus would not deny any of this. However, from a Stoic point of view, none of these things can harm or injure us in any deep or significant sense. The reason for this is that what is taken from us by bodily injury, exile, or even death is not what is most important, and it is not anything that belongs to us in a genuine sense. But we will have more to say on this point later in the video. The third benefit Epictetus identifies deals with our ability to take responsibility for our actions. By disciplining our mind, we can conquer our temptation to find fault with others. As such, Stoicism provides the antidote to the feelings of resentment and disempowerment that undermine our happiness. When we focus on what is within our power, then we can take responsibility for the success or failure of our efforts. Furthermore, if we fail in our aims, we will not be tempted to see other people or the universe as a whole as conspirators against us. We will feel no need to see ourselves as victims of arbitrary fortune. Rather, since our success or failure is squarely within our control, we only need to rededicate ourselves to the Stoic practice of disciplining the mind whenever we come up short. This general explanation of the Stoic approach to life leaves some important questions unanswered. How do we apply this knowledge to daily practice? How does a Stoic conceive of and respond to life's challenges? And does Stoic practice permit us to live full and flourishing human lives? We will begin to address these questions in the next section of this video. Once we have come to understand the difference between what is within our power and what is beyond our power, how does that knowledge help us to live well? Epictetus believes that if we take this distinction seriously, we will see that the only path to a good life requires complete indifference toward external goods. We must not allow ourselves any inclination, however slight, toward the attainment of these things. In fact, it is the desire for external goods that undermines two primary components of a life well lived. Specifically, he argues that if we desire external goods, then we will certainly fail of that by which alone happiness and freedom are procured. However, eliminating our natural desire for external goods is not an easy thing. It requires a fundamental transformation of how we view what is normally thought of as bad or misfortunate. it requires a complete reorienting of how we think about what happens in our lives. In the following passage, Epictetus explains that we should view these events as mere unpleasing semblances, which are nothing to us. Seek at once, therefore, to be able to say to every unpleasing semblance, you are but a semblance and by no means the real thing. And then examine it by those rules which you have, and first and chiefly by this, whether it concerns the things which are within our power, or those which are not. And if it concerns anything beyond our power, be prepared to say that it is nothing to you. But what does it mean to say that a bad event is just an unpleasing semblance? The term semblance indicates the idea of a misleading appearance. Epictetus means to criticize the way in which we normally and naturally view the events that occur in our lives. When some event occurs, it produces some sensation or experience. Typically, these reactions can be classified as either pleasing or unpleasing. When we have a nice day with our family, get a promotion at work, or get to relax on the beach, we experience some sort of pleasant or pleasing sensation. Familial conflict, or being fired from our job, or having the airport lose our luggage all produce unpleasant sensations. Furthermore, these sensations tend to associate with certain kinds of reactions. When things go well for us, we might find ourselves happily proclaiming that we have had a stroke of good luck. On the other hand, when we suffer something unpleasant, we may find ourselves complaining about our bad fortune and asking, why did this have to happen to me? The critical thing to notice here is that there is a difference between the sensations we experience and how we react to those sensations. We cannot control the fact that relaxing on the beach is enjoyable and that being fired is humiliating. These are simply facts about our human nature. However, it is another matter entirely how we react to these situations and feelings. We can let the pleasing experiences overcome us with a level of unsustainable joy and elation, and we can let unpleasant experiences sink us into a state of despair and frustration. However, such reactions are not necessitated. This is precisely why Epictetus labels pleasing and unpleasing sensations as semblances. These sensations lead us into certain kinds of common reactions, but in doing so, conceal the fact that the choice of how to react still lies within our power. To understand this, consider how a Stoic would react to pleasant and unpleasant experiences. The Stoic would recognize that the good and bad events that happen to us are not within our control. As such, we should not concern ourselves with these. Instead of letting our emotions get away from ourselves, instead of being so invested in what are mere semblances, the Stoic would cultivate an attitude of indifference. The Stoic would recognize that experienced sensations are not the real thing. The Stoic would remind himself that the event is nothing to him. Now, we do not need to deny ourselves pleasure when good things happen, but neither should we be fixated on striving after such experiences. We should not think that whether we are living well hinges on what people think about us, or our success at work, or whether our vacation plans go smoothly. Likewise, neither should we think that a misfortune dooms us to frustration and failure. We should cultivate an attitude of moderation and Stoic indifference which reflects our recognition of this fact. We should not, through our emotional reactions, invest pleasant and unpleasant sensations which are really nothing more, again, than mere semblances, with more significance than they really deserve. Cultivating Stoic indifference, however, is not easy. As Epictetus puts it, when dealing with things that delight the mind or contribute to use or are tenderly beloved, it can be very difficult to remind ourselves of their nature. It can be difficult to remind ourselves that these things are mere semblances. For that reason, adopting the Stoic outlook takes deliberate training and practice. I will make a few comments here about the process of training ourselves to live as Stoics. However, for further explanation, see the supplemental lecture video entitled Stoic Practice and Living Well that can be found in the description section of this video. In our effort to train ourselves in Stoic practice, Epictetus recommends beginning with the merest trifles. Think of a time when you got angry or frustrated over something that, in the grand scheme of things, you know is not really that important. At some point, we have all become flustered over misplacing our keys, forgetting something at home, or, as the proverbial saying goes, found ourselves crying over spilled milk. The Stoic philosophy can be of great practical use to us in overcoming these daily frustrations, disappointments, and overreactions. Epictetus gives the following example. If you have a favorite cup, then you should remind yourself that it is but a cup of which you are fond. Notice what Epictetus has done here with the concept of favorite. When something is our favorite, we invest ourselves into that thing, and in extreme cases, imagine it is something we cannot live without. We seem to think that the characteristic of favorite is an objective quality of the thing itself that makes it irreplaceable and indispensable. However, the fact that something is our favorite merely means that we have a certain feeling or attitude toward it. It just means that we are fond of it. All of this is based upon our subjective feelings, and consequently, our relationship toward the cup could very well be otherwise. For that reason, we might be able to train ourselves to place much less stock in this cup. We might be able to train ourselves to see this object for what it really is, just another external good whose existence has no bearing upon our moral character or our ability to live well. For these reasons, once we adopt the right perspective, if our cup was broken, even if it is our favorite, then we should be able to bear it. As such, we should treat the feelings of disappointment that would accompany the breaking of our cup just like we would treat any other unpleasing semblance. We should tell ourselves that the disappointment I feel from my cup breaking is but a semblance and by no means the real thing. Because this is the case, we should also tell ourselves that my cup breaking is nothing to me. When we apply Epictetus' advice to the inevitable challenges and inconveniences of daily life, then it is easy to see the wisdom of Stoicism. Minor accidents, annoying obstacles, and frustrated expectations are simply a part of life. And it is all too easy to find ourselves exaggerating these things and reacting in unproductive ways. As such, it is a great virtue of the Stoic philosophy that it inculcates the ability to respond positively to minor setbacks. At the same time, we might wonder whether this way of life is simply too extreme. Consider the general structure of Epictetus' advice. We should only focus on what is within our control. Everything else is a mere external good. The feelings we have toward those things are mere semblances, and consequently, none of those things should matter to us. That may be sound advice when dealing with mere trifles, but should this advice be applied universally? Are there certain external goods that should matter to us in a deep and profound way? To consider this question, let's think about a second example that is given by Epictetus. He says, if you embrace your child or your wife, remind yourself that you embrace a mortal, and thus, if either of them dies, you can bear it. I think there is good reason to be critical of this passage, but first we should consider the real wisdom it contains. In order to see external goods for what they are, we need to be able to recognize the limitations of things. Consider again the example of the broken cup. One reason we shouldn't get upset about this is that the breaking of the cup is inevitable. The cup is a physical object that will only last a finite amount of time. At some point, it will break apart, wear down, be destroyed, and no longer exist. Given this, it would seem strange to be upset over the cup breaking. Did we expect the cup to last forever? Wouldn't that be unreasonable? Anything we enjoy is limited. A good meal, a relaxing vacation, a stimulating book or movie, all of these must come to an end. To feel sad or disappointed when this happens seems to implicitly assume that these enjoyments are permanent. In the present passage, Epictetus makes the same point about human life itself. It is entirely natural to feel a profound sense of grief and sorrow when a loved one passes away. But are such feelings rational? We all know that our lives are temporary. No human being is immortal. So does it make sense to feel sorrow towards something that is entirely predictable and inevitable? If we see the things we hold dear for what they really are, if we see the cup as a breakable physical object, if we see human life as necessarily finite, then we will have no reason to let our emotions get the best of us when the consequences of that limited nature become manifest. When a loved one dies, we will not have any reason to be upset because we never expected anything different to happen. Epictetus would have us control our grief in just the same way that we control our daily disappointment. We should tell ourselves that the grief I feel from my spouse dying is but a semblance and by no means the real thing. We should consequently believe that my spouse dying is nothing to me. However, once this comparison between a broken cup and a deceased spouse is made explicit, we might conclude that Epictetus' Stoic approach is simply too extreme. It may very well be the case that we should see a cup as nothing to us. But how could we say the same thing about our spouse? If someone really did say that their spouse dying was nothing to them, we would conclude that they were not a very good husband or wife. Such a person must severely misunderstand what it means to be in that kind of relationship. Of course, it is never good to become permanently overwhelmed by grief. Yet it also seems reasonable to think that someone should feel profound grief and sadness at least for some time if their spouse were to die. But why is that the case? The relationship of husband and wife is supposed to be one that is based upon love for the other person. And love is something that can only exist between people who share some sort of deep bond, connection, and attachment. To love another person, I have to care deeply about what happens to them and desire what is best for them. In short, what happens to that person must matter to me. So to say that my spouse dying is nothing to me sounds not only callous and hard-hearted, but seems to contradict the very nature of love itself. The root of this problem can be found in the foundation of Epictetus' philosophy. The Stoic way of life requires cultivating a sense of detachment from any and all external goods. Now, there are obviously unhealthy attachments we can develop, but surely not all attachments are unhealthy. In fact, some attachments, such as deep relationships with those we love, seem necessary for living a full human life. To live a life completely without attachment, a life focused narrowly on what is within our power, seems like a shallow way to live. Why pursue any goal if the outcome means nothing? Why develop a relationship with another person if we are indifferent to how things go for them? In large measure, I think Epictetus would accept this criticism and hold fast to the view that we should strive for detachment. The intense natural attachments we feel to our goals or other people ultimately cause us disturbance and rob us of our freedom. Still, I think there is at least a partial response that Epictetus could offer to this objection. The person who feels no grief from the death of their spouse seems to have demonstrated that they never really loved that person. They've shown a lack of care for their spouse's misfortune, a lack of concern for the harm suffered by their spouse. However, this idea assumes that their spouse has been harmed by death. It assumes that death harms the one who dies. But if death does not harm the one who dies, then one's spouse has not been harmed by dying, and consequently, perhaps Stoic indifference in the face of the spouse's death would not be inappropriate. Evaluating this line of reasoning requires an understanding of what it means for a person to suffer harm and an understanding of what causes harm. In the next section of this video, we will consider these questions from a Stoic perspective. Epictetus recommends a stance of indifference toward our own personal misfortunes. He also recommends a kind of indifference toward the suffering of others. He tells us that when you see anyone weeping for grief, either that his son has gone abroad or that he has suffered in his affairs, take care not to be overcome by the apparent evil, but discriminate and be ready to say, what hurts this man is not this occurrence itself, for another man might not be hurt by it, but the view he chooses to take of it. As far as conversation goes, however, do not disdain to accommodate yourself to him, and, if need be, to groan with him. Take heed, however, not to groan inwardly too. Here Epictetus cautions us against overreacting to another's misfortune. Just as we should not be overcome with grief if our spouse dies, neither should we be overcome with sadness by commiserating with another. Interestingly, Epictetus states that we may be permitted to show some emotion, but there is a sense in which this show of emotion is only outward. Another's suffering should not genuinely affect us and disturb our Stoic tranquility. As Epictetus puts it, we should not groan inwardly too. This is another passage that seems to portray Stoicism in a rather extreme light. It makes Stoicism seem simply too callous and too indifferent to encapsulate what it means to live a good human life. So why does Epictetus recommend that we respond to the suffering of others in this detached, impersonal, and perhaps even disingenuous way? The answer has to do with how the Stoics conceive of harm. Epictetus tells us that what hurts this man is not this occurrence itself, for another man might not be hurt by it. Rather, it is the view he chooses to take of it. To understand this claim, let's begin with what I call the non-Stoic conception of harm. This is the notion of harm that most people would likely take to be common sense. On this conception, first, there is some event that occurs. Perhaps someone gets sick or is injured or is the victim of theft or has a beloved family member die. This event causes a harm to that person. To be sick is, in itself, a harm to the person who is suffering the illness. And as a result, the person in question will likely feel some set of negative emotions like sadness, grief, or resentment, among many others. The important point here is that the harm is prior to the emotion. The person who feels depressed and sad about being sick has already suffered harm before feeling these negative emotions. The negative emotions are simply a reflection of the harm that has already taken place. As a result, we are unable to prevent ourselves from suffering harm, or at least we cannot inoculate ourselves against being harmed simply through regulating our emotional reactions. The Stoic conception of harm reverses this order. On the Stoic conception, there are many events that occur in our lives, but none of those events are necessarily harmful. Whether some event is harmful depends entirely upon our reaction to it. Whether a person is harmed by some event depends upon the view he chooses to take of it. If a person responds to illness, injustice, and loss with negative emotions like sadness, resentment, or grief, then they will suffer harm. By giving in to one's emotions and turning one's focus toward external goods, we give up the only sure path to living well, and we suffer as a result. However, if a person responds to these same events with indifference, then he or she will not be harmed. If we remind ourselves of the true nature of external goods like health, wealth, and family, if we remind ourselves that these are temporary and not within our power, then we will not experience frustration, sadness, grief, or resentment. Later in the Enchiridion, Epictetus tells us that it is not he who gives abuse who affronts. Rather, it is the view we take of these things as insulting. It is not, for example, the rude person at the supermarket who harms us by saying something offensive. Whatever harm this brings about is caused by our own inability to control our emotions and our own decision to take offense. This is why whatever causes a person to suffer might not hurt another person. The other person may choose to react in a more stoic way. He might choose to react with indifference instead of sadness, anxiety, offense, grief, or resentment. Ultimately, we ourselves are responsible for whether we suffer harm. Negative emotion is not the consequence of a harm that has already occurred. Rather, the negative emotions we permit ourselves to feel are precisely what causes us to experience harm in the first place. With these points in place, we can now reconsider some of Epictetus' previous comments about how we should respond to death, both the death of other people as well as how we should think about our own impending demise. And we will turn to these points in the final section of this video. We can now see more clearly why the Stoics believe that attaching ourselves to external goods will cause us to be harmed. No matter how jealously we guard some external good, it will inevitably be taken from us, even if only by our death. As such, if what causes harm is how we react to what happens in our life, then inculcating a sense of attachment to anything will cause us to react negatively when we inevitably lose that thing. And of course, that is precisely what Epictetus identifies as the cause of harm. So while Epictetus does not prohibit the enjoyment of external goods, he does advocate training ourselves to part with them in a mature way when the time comes. He uses the following analogy to make this point. Epictetus imagines a person on a voyage in which the ship is at anchor and everyone on the crew has gone on to the shore. Epictetus tells us that while there, you may amuse yourself with picking up a shellfish or a truffle in your way, but your thoughts ought to be bent towards the ship and perpetually attentive, lest the captain should call, and then you must leave all these things that you may not have to be carried on board the vessel, bound like a sheep. There's nothing wrong with exploring the shore and taking amusement in what we might find there. However, it would be wrong of us to become so attached to what we find on the shore. We should not forsake the rest of the voyage so we can continue to look for the largest or most beautiful seashells. We should listen attentively for the captain's call and be ready to drop what we are doing at a moment's notice to return to the ship. We need to recognize that our time on shore is temporary. If we fail to do this, we may find ourselves forced to suffer some rather undignified treatment. The person who refuses to leave shore when it is time, who is so attached to collecting seashells that he simply cannot leave it alone voluntarily, will have to be dragged away kicking and screaming, or as Epictetus puts it, bound like a sheep. And this is not a picture of someone who exercises their freedom in a mature and dignified manner. The same is true of anything else that we might enjoy in our lives. Likewise in life, Epictetus says, if instead of a truffle or shellfish, such a thing as a wife or a child be granted you, there is no objection. But if the captain calls, run to the ship, leave all these things, and never look behind. But if you are old, never go far from the ship, lest you should be missing when called for. If someone is fortunate enough to have a spouse or child, then their company should be enjoyed. However, we must also be able to let these things go when the time comes. At a certain point, death takes those we love from us, or it takes us from them. And death will eventually make our pursuit of wealth, power, and honor seem very trivial. So, in order to avoid attachment, and to avoid the harm it inevitably produces, we need to be able to leave all these things behind and never look back, when that time arrives. This requires reckoning seriously with our mortality. As we age and approach closer to death, we must prepare ourselves to leave the goods of this world behind with grace and dignity. Again, the image of someone being dragged back to the ship to continue the voyage is applicable here. Epictetus admonishes those who are old to never go far from the ship. This is because we all face death, but not everyone reacts to death in the same way. A person might, like the reluctant voyager, debase himself by spending his final days and hours lamenting his fate. On the other hand, one might face death courageously, recognize the inevitability of death, and accept that his time has come to an end. It is only in this way that we avoid the negative emotions of fear, anxiety, and loss that so commonly plague our thoughts of death. Confronting death in a Stoic manner is difficult, and it would be unreasonable to expect it if we have not trained ourselves to do this during our lifetime. For this reason, Epictetus recommends that we keep death daily before our eyes. We should admit to ourselves that we will die one day, think about our death, recognize its inevitability, our inability to defeat it, and consider how we should react in light of these facts. This requires daily meditation on the fact of our own mortality and inevitable demise. And if we do so, then Epictetus tells us we will never entertain any abject thought, nor too eagerly covet anything. The person who truly understands the way in which death delimits our life, how it makes anything we now enjoy temporary, will never become too attached to any external good, including the good of life itself. Such a person will express neither surprise nor mourning when the time comes, and will experience neither fear nor anxiety in the anticipation of death. As a consequence, from the Stoic point of view, such a person will have put themselves on the only sure road to freedom, happiness, and a life well lived.